You are hearing about Peppol and mandatory e-invoicing everywhere these days. But what exactly is Peppol? How does it benefit your business? In this video, we will break it down for you and see how Peppol works in practice through a concrete example involving Frank, a supplier, and Bob, a buyer. They are both operating VAT-registered businesses in Belgium, so the Peppol mandatory B2B invoicing applies to them. Let's dive in. Bob, the baker, constantly needs flour to bake his delicious bread. He has a contract with Frank, the farmer, to purchase his exceptional windmilled flour. Today, Frank delivers the flour to Bob. Now, Frank issues an invoice to Bob for his fulfilled order through his invoice receivable software called IR. Not very original, I know. This software is used by Frank to manage all his outgoing invoices. Frank knows the VAT number of Bob. This number is part of the invoicing data. Based on this VAT number, the IR software can automatically derive two Peppol identifiers for Bob. The one starting with 0208 is for his company number. The one starting with 9925 is for his VAT number. The IR software of Frank uses Digiteal as Peppol Access Point. It calls the API of Digiteal to enable e-invoicing. First, it will call the getSupportedDocumentTypes endpoint to see if Bob can receive invoices through Peppol. It makes the call for the 0208 Peppol identifier of Bob, and it returns an HTTP 404 error not found. This means that Bob's company number is unknown in the Peppol network. The IR software then proceeds to try the second Peppol identifier. If it also responds with an HTTP 404, then it knows that the invoice cannot be sent to Bob through Peppol. This leads to case 1 with legacy invoicing. The IR software of Frank will generate the PDF invoice 123 and send it via email to Bob. Frank has no idea if Bob received the email, and he receives no feedback for weeks. Until he either sees that he got paid by Bob by checking his bank statements, that's the happy case, or he receives an email back from Bob saying that he did not like the flour and that he rejects the invoice. In most cases, neither of those will happen in the next few weeks, and this will lead to credit collection. Frank's IR software will then start sending reminders to Bob via email, SMS, and maybe even by calling Bob to get his payment. If none of this worked and the invoice is still pending payment, Bob might receive an unpleasant lawyer's mail with a lot of extra penalties. All of this is undesirable and unfortunately common with legacy invoicing. In the happy case, the call to get supported document types is not a 404 not found, but a 200 OK, which confirms that Bob can receive invoices through Peppol. This leads to the Peppol invoicing case. Frank's IR software creates a UBL standard document for invoice 124. This document is an XML that contains all the invoice data in a structured way. It is advised that it will also contain the PDF representation of the invoice in case a human would need to see it. Frank's IR software then sends it to the Digiteal access point by calling the sendUBL endpoint. The access point will then validate that the recipient, Bob, can receive invoices through Peppol. Then it will validate that the structure of the invoice is correct. The valid invoice will be sent from the access point of Frank to the access point of Bob. Bob's access point will confirm that the invoice has been received through a signed message. Frank's access point will then respond to the IR software synchronously to confirm that the invoice has been sent. In Frank's IR software, he can see that the invoice is sent. That's a good first step. Asynchronously, the confirmation of receipt of Bob's access point is received by Frank's access point. That in turn informs Frank's IR software. Now, Frank has proof that the invoice has been delivered. If Bob would claim that he never received the invoice, Frank will be able to prove that it was delivered. But Bob won't do this because he's an honest guy. Optionally, there can be even more feedback, starting with message level responses, MLR in short. When the access point of Bob is processing the invoice, it can acknowledge it was received, accepted, or rejected. Let's focus on the happy case in which the invoice has been accepted. If Frank's IR software can process MLRs, then Bob's access point will generate the MLR indicating that the technical processing of the invoice has led it to be accepted. This MLR is then sent to Frank's access point and from there to the IR software. Frank can now see that the invoice processing was successful. Bob's access point is now going to transfer the invoice to Bob's invoice payable software called IP. I know this name isn't very original either. This software is used by Bob to manage all his incoming invoices. Bob sees that he received invoice 124. Bob's IP software is great, and it supports the optional invoice responses. As soon as the invoice is received by Bob's IP software, it checks if Frank can receive invoice responses. And if it does, it will create a document to acknowledge that invoice 124 has been successfully received. The support of invoice response document type is optional, but it is valuable because now Frank knows that the invoice has been received in Bob's IP software. Bob will now process the invoice. He can put it in process, under query, accept it, conditionally accept it, reject it, and pay it. All of these changes in the status of the invoice can lead to new invoice responses. In this case, Bob will open invoice 124, which will put it in process. This status will be sent from Bob's IP software to Frank's IR software through the Peppol network. Then, Bob will accept invoice 124, and this change will also lead to the status being changed in Frank's IR software. Frank can follow in real time the status of invoice 124, which changes as Bob processes it. Since he accepted the invoice, Bob will now proceed to pay it. Through an integration to initiate payments via his bank, also provided by Digiteal, Bob is directly redirected to his bank application to confirm the payment. The integration also allows Bob to directly see that the invoice has been paid in his IP software. The invoice response, notifying that the invoice has been paid, is sent through the Peppol network to Frank. He knows that Bob paid it, but it might take some time before he sees the funds on his bank account. Through an open banking integration, also provided by Digiteal, Frank's IR software can receive his latest bank movements in real time. This allows him to see that he has received Bob's payment. During this journey of invoice 124, one invoice, one confirmation of receipt, one MLR, accepted, and 4 invoice responses, acknowledged, in process, accepted, and paid, were transferred in a matter of seconds. Frank had full visibility on what was going on. Bob was able to automatically process the document and keep his supplier informed. No human intervention was required except for Bob to validate the payment. The whole process can take less than a minute with instant payments. To enable this, send an email to hello@digiteal.eu. Oh, and by the way, we still have no news of invoice 123, but don't worry, Frank will probably start sending reminders in a few weeks.